Sorry.
Pratt & Whitney problem.
Yeah, you all ready, Joe? You all ready? Well, I want to welcome all of our members to our hearing today. I'm particularly pleased to have some of our nation's foremost naval experts providing testimony before our subcommittee. We have the Honorable John F. Layman, a former Secretary of the Navy, and Admiral Robert J. Natter, U.S. Navy retired, former Commander of Fleet Forces Command. Gentlemen, thank you so much for all that you've done for our country, and we are delighted to have you with us today. When John Layman stepped down as Secretary of the Navy in 1987, we had 594 ships. When Admiral Natter retired from the Navy in 2003, we had 297 ships. Today, we have 272 ships. The size of our fleet is only one metric for Navy strength, but it's an important one. And while I firmly believe that the United States Navy remains the most powerful and capable maritime force in the world, I'm concerned about the future and the trend lines that we see in those 3 points. We've heard from the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Richardson, that we are returning to an era of great power competition in which our maritime superiority will be contested. We've heard that gaps in our aircraft carrier presence will continue to occur in the Middle East and the Pacific. We've heard from the Marine Corps that shortfalls in amphibious ships are driving them to consider deploying aboard foreign ships. A few weeks ago, Admiral Harris, our commander in the Pacific, testified to Congress that the Navy can currently only fulfill 62% of his demand for submarines. We all thought that sounded pretty dire, but just last week I was informed by the Navy that across the board the Navy will only be able to meet 42% of anticipated demand for forces in fiscal year 2017. So it turns out that Admiral Harris' situation may actually be above average, an alarming realization indeed. The conclusion we should all be drawing from this data is that we need more ships and more aircraft and more investment in other elements and enablers of naval power. The administration points to a ship construction program that will meet the 380-ship Navy in the next few years. However, if one looks under the hood of this car, one sees some disturbing details. The administration continues to count ships that they intend to shrink wrap and tie to the pier. Once again, they're proposing to lay up half of our cruisers and truncate the procurement of small surface combatants. Now in fiscal year 2017, they are asking for permission to deactivate an entire carrier air wing. These trend lines are indeed concerning and point to a clear need to provide additional investment in our Navy and in the other elements of our national defense. They are also evidence, I believe, of malaise and a lack of vision in thinking about American sea power. While I believe that our uniformed leaders are fully capable of providing this vision and leadership, I believe the administration and the next must place a higher priority on national security and the strength of our Navy. Our witnesses today have fought these battles before and are a clear source of inspiration as we navigate these troubled waters and seek to rebuild our maritime strength. We're indebted to them for their service, and today we once again call on their wisdom and foresight. I look forward to hearing their thoughts. But now I turn to my good friend and colleague, the ranking member of the subcommittee, Congressman Joe Courtney of Connecticut, for any comments he might have.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding today's hearing to hear the views of our two distinguished witnesses on the Navy's force structure. As the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral John Richardson, shared with our committee last month, the Navy is undergoing a review of its force structure assessment. Given the changing dynamics around the world, the growing demand for our ships, and the increasing strain on our naval fleet, I welcome this reassessment of our force structure requirements, which is the subject of today's hearing. Our current fleet requirements stand at 308 ships, which, thanks to the 84 ships under contract over the last several years, we expect to reach within the next 5 years. That is good news, but it's just a start, because even under the Navy's plan, we will not sustain the levels needed to fully support the various components of that fleet. While the 30-year shipbuilding plan for 2017 has still not been submitted to Congress, we expect it to reflect what we saw in the 2016 plan, that even when we meet the 308-ship goal, key shortfalls will remain. For example, we will face shortages in small and large surface combatants as well as attack submarines over the next 3 decades. Additional shortfalls remain in the fighter aircraft and other capabilities that will be key to combating the challenges of the future. Notably, one area that the CNO singled out for particular review in the force structure assessment was our attack submarine force. The current requirement of 48 was set nearly a decade ago, before undersea resurgence that we see now by China and Russia. Retired Admiral Jim Stavridis told our panel that Russian submarine activity is probably 70 to 80% of what we saw during Cold War times. Admiral Harris told us of his concern that the U.S. submarine force will dip to 41 at a time when China is increasing their fleet size and advancing their undersea capabilities. European Commander General Breedlove told us that the submarine shortfall leaves us playing zone defense in the North Atlantic. And above all, our combatant commanders have been clear to us that the current fleet of 54 attack submarines, let alone the future force of 41 or even 48, cannot adequately meet the demand of our undersea capabilities. That is the kind of area that begs for reassessment, and I look forward to the outcome of their review, not just for submarines, but across all aspects of our naval fleet. However, if we are ever going to reach the required fleet size, Congress and the nation must grapple with the dual challenges of the Budget Control Act and the critical need to recapitalize our sea-based strategic deterrent submarine fleet without depleting resources for other vital shipbuilding programs. If not addressed, both of these issues will significantly impact our ability to build and sustain the fleet we need. I hope our witnesses will share their views on both subjects with us today. The shortfalls we will face are largely the result of decisions made in previous decades, which we cannot undo in a single year. What we can do, though, is continue to work in a bipartisan way to address our current and future shipbuilding needs going forward. I'm proud that this panel has a record of doing so, and I look forward to sustaining that record. The witnesses' input today is vital as we prepare to mark up the 2017 Defense Authorization Bill and continue to build the fleet we need for the future. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Courtney. And without objection, Secretary Layman and Admiral Natter's written testimony will be made a part of the record. No objection, so it will be so entered. And with that, Mr. Secretary, we're delighted to have you here, and we look forward to any opening remarks that you might have for us. Secretary, you might want to push that.
Sorry.
That's all right.
It's been a long time since I've been before this distinguished committee, and it really is distinguished. I spent hundreds of hours before this committee and your predecessors. Charlie Bennett, I think I spent more time with Charlie when I was secretary than I did with anybody else but my wife. And the history that this subcommittee and its predecessor committee has had in building and leading, helping to lead executive branches to form the kind of Navy that has prevented wars and prevented us losing wars, stands out among all committees, in my judgment, in the history of the Congress. And you've been able to carry that tradition and are continuing to lead and show a vision of where a bipartisan naval strategy can be achieved. So thank you for that. I'm delighted to be back. It's been a long time, but as you know, just so everybody knows my prejudices, the naval tradition in my family is old. George Layman was in the Revolutionary Navy. My great-grandfather was in the Union Navy. My father was in World War II. I was a reserve naval aviator for 25 years and ended up touching virtually every trouble spot during that period. My son was a naval aviator with 3 tours on the Teddy Roosevelt and all the combat areas. So I come with prejudices. I was Secretary of the Navy for 6 years. The accomplishments of the Navy in those years, I think, was made possible because, particularly starting in 77, 78, 79, your subcommittee and the Sea Power Subcommittee on the Senate side laid the groundwork, the intellectual groundwork, at a time when the nation was not fully conscious of what the dangers really were, that we were, in fact, losing the Cold War. And as a result of the groundwork and the foundation of strategic thinking that was laid by your subcommittee in those years leading up to 1981, the possibility of a bipartisan majority starting in 1981, led on the Senate side Scoop Jackson and others, and on the House side by Charlie Bennett, and with President Reagan adopting basically what your philosophy had laid down, the intellectual foundations, we were able to reverse what was a very unpleasant result of the post-Vietnam War letdown and disarmament that had undertaken. I think that history will show that it was those years that led to, that really won the war, the Cold War at sea. It was the demonstration that we could build a Navy and maintain a Navy without breaking the bank, and we could defeat the Soviet forces at sea, and I think that was a major contribution to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, as I've said before, quoting my boss, my old boss, Henry Kissinger, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And we are rhyming again now, not only with the post-Vietnam period of disarmament, but we're rhyming more disturbingly with the 1930s and the reverse of what Teddy Roosevelt famously argued for, to speak softly but carry a big stick. We are currently speaking loudly about Chinese incursions in the South China Sea, the Russian Navy incursions, and yet we are carrying an ever smaller stick. And while the intentions and naval policy has always been bipartisan, but sometimes the reality of what is really happening compared to what the hope and intention of Congress is are not the same. The fact is, we have allowed inattention over 20 years to the structure, the practices, the bureaucracy of the Department of Defense, that it has become so dysfunctional that we currently have, according to the GAO, $450 billion of cost overruns in current programs. Those are going to have to be paid. These are contractual obligations. They're not funded. That is about 6 years of the procurement budgets for ACAT 1 and 2 programs. And every year we're averaging about 20% cost overruns, regardless of non-McCurdy breaches and so forth. That's what the real numbers are. So we are disarming rapidly. We are spending today roughly the same in constant dollars as we did at the height of the Reagan administration. And we have an Army not of 20 divisions as Reagan built, but 8. We have an Air Force of not 35 tactical fighter wings as President Reagan built, but 15. We don't have 220 strategic bombers, as Reagan had. We have 72. We don't have a 594 ship Navy, as Reagan built with that same amount of money, but we have 272. This is unilateral disarmament, and I'm just so really optimistic and delighted about what you did in this committee and working with the Senate to start really fundamental reform, not the kind of reform that everybody talks about every year. We're going to reform this and reform that, but what you all did in the NDAA that was signed earlier this year, and what you are on the route of doing for the NDAA for this year is truly historic, and starts the process of dismantling this vast bureaucratic amorphous entity that has strangled innovation, strangled cost control, strangled common sense. We've got to do that if we're going to get back to the kind of effective procurement to rebuild a Navy that is sufficient in size and quality to deter as we deterred the 600-ship Navy as an objective was not to win a war, it was to deter a war, and it succeeded. It ended the Cold War without really firing a shot. And unfortunately, today we're doing the opposite. We are getting weaker, the threat is getting more sophisticated and diverse in more places around the world than we had in the nice bipolar Cold War. And so we've really got to reverse before it leads to unintended combat, in which we could well lose. But so I look forward to your questions, and thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Mr. Secretary, thank you. Admiral Natter?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Forbes, Ranking Member Courtney, ladies and gentlemen, I'm honored to be here as an independent witness before your subcommittee, sitting next to Secretary Layman, someone who the Navy certainly respects and admires for what he and the administration of President Reagan were able to accomplish. I can say that my family doesn't have near the historical platitudes that Secretary Layman talked about, although I must admit I have 6 brothers, 6 of whom were naval officers and 1 Air Force officer, and we still love him. And I have 3 daughters. All 3 served in the Navy. 2 still are naval officers, and 2 sons-in-law are in the Navy. So I have a vested interest, like so many of us, in what happens to our military today, and especially what happens to our young men and women serving if we call on them to go to combat. I'm quite honestly worried today about the troubling reduction in the size of our Navy and the shrinking of our technology advantage. There's a dangerous myth out there, espoused by some, that our shrinking numbers happily can be offset by our technology, that our ships today are so much better than our ships of the past. The uncomfortable little truth, though, is that although our ships are indeed better than they were in the past, our potential adversaries are not producing buggy whips and ships of sail either. And in fact, some, not most, but some of their technologies are in fact better than ours today. The truth is, numbers do count, and the truth is, we need more ships and aircraft in our Navy today. Let me expand on that a bit. With respect to the Navy's force structure, the current number of that force structure is 308. But as a practical matter, that number is not achievable without top-line relief of the Navy's SCN account to accommodate the Ohio replacement program. Everyone knows that. There are solutions out there. There are critics of those solutions for very valid and very long-standing criticisms of those approaches. But the reality is that without an alternative, without a top-line increase or some other account to accommodate this national strategic requirement, the Navy's shipbuilding account is not worth the paper it's written on. And given today's realities, what are those? A fast-growing Chinese military force structure and its actions in Asia waters that essentially are grabbing 600,000 square miles of ocean resources. With North Korea developing nuclear weapons and the means to deliver them. No one disagrees with that. We're watching it happen. With Russian naval deployments returning to Cold War levels. That's not a secret. Everyone's aware of that. And with ongoing terrorism deployments on the part of our Navy. My view is, given those realities that I just laid out, our minimum number of Navy combatant force structure ships has to be, today, given that threat, about 350 ships. I mean, all you have to do is look at the number of ships we had when I was commander of the 7th Fleet in Asia and the opposition that we faced in those days. The problems today are much more serious, and the numbers of those potential adversaries the numbers they have are much more serious than when I was there, and yet the numbers of our ships and aircraft are smaller. We've got to have at least a 350-ship Navy to be able to confront the kinds of challenges that we face today and those technologies that those challenges have, and the appropriate number of balanced aircraft to operate with them. With that, I'm going to hush and then open it up to your questions. Thank you.
Admiral, thank you. I'm going to defer my questions until the end to make sure all of our members can get theirs in. So with that, we recognize Mr. Courtney for any questions he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, thank you for your great testimony this morning to both witnesses. Secretary Layman, again, you described the process that occurred in the late 70s and early 80s in terms of trying to determine what a proper force structure number should be. And could you elaborate a little bit more in terms of just where did that begin? Did it begin with sort of an assessment of just what are the threats out there, and then sort of build the number from that, or the industrial base, or what was sort of the origination of that process?
That's an excellent question because, the history you don't know, you're bound to repeat. So one of the reasons that the 600-ship Navy, which was truly a bipartisan naval rebuilding program, never really changed from the first time it was proposed in detail with budgets, and it was in the supplemental in 1980. Never changed until the end of the Bush administration and the fall of the Soviet Union, was because it wasn't just pulled out of thin air. It wasn't just political theater. It was derived from a careful analysis by multiple sources, including CNA, the Sea-Plan 2000 study, the Naval War College, about where our true vital interests were in the world, and what the threat was in each of those areas, mainly from the Soviet Union and its allies, and then what force structure was needed to effectively deny the Soviet Union any thoughts that they could prevail and close off choke points or interdict the sea lines of communication between NATO and North America. Every single one of these vital areas, vital to the security of the United States, was carefully analyzed, and from that, the force structure needed to protect those vital areas was derived. And that's basically how we came up with 600 ships and 15 carrier battle groups and 100 nuclear attack submarines, quite apart from the strategic equation. There was a logic to it. There was a discipline and a rigor to it. And it held up because it was not esoteric. It was not based on complex algorithms of force exchanges and so forth. And that's what we need and lack today, I think. A bipartisan acceptance of what our national strategy really is. And with that national strategy, we can derive the force structure that the minimum that we have to have, accepting the fact that we, as we did then, had fully integrated B-52s and Air Force assets into the naval strategy, the capabilities and force structures of our allies, and we do that today. So I think using that same discipline, that same rigor, and that same logic, that the minimum figure is the one that I would fully endorse with Admiral Natter, which is roughly 350 ships. The number of aircraft carriers, don't forget, aircraft carriers are the one absolute that any naval formation or any naval activity has to have. They provide the disc. It's the carrier that provides the disc 600 miles across of total air superiority that protects every other ship, whether it's an Army transport or a fast deployment ship or reefers or the small boys in a battle group. There, my number would be 15. And I think that can be achieved if the reforms that this committee has pushed and proposed on fundamentally streamlining and reducing that vast choking bureaucracy in the Department of Defense to get back to fixed pricing and get back to the disciplines of no change orders once production is approved. We're not going to get there right away, but in the meantime, we have to show intent, because in 1981, we had fewer than 500 ships, we had 13 aircraft carriers, and we had terrible morale. You'll recall those of you from the Tidewater area that in '79 there were 4 ships that could not deploy because they didn't have the sailors. I mean, retention was terrible. We're heading right down that road again. We're having, we're succumbing to that same siren song that we heard in the '30s and we heard in the '70s. We'll do more with less. But yet we can't do more with less. We have to do less with less. But the temptation to do more is there, and so we found in the '70s we ended up with 11-month deployments, some of them as long as 12-month deployments, when history has proven that if you keep sailors at sea away from their families for more than 6 months over time, they'll do it in a surge or a war, but otherwise you are going to destroy the infrastructure of your Navy in skilled people, in morale, in readiness, the uprates of aircraft on carriers, the ship systems, and so forth. So we're headed down that road. We're doing it. We're, regardless of what people say, the deployments, as you all know, are now, many of them, well beyond 6 months, and we're starting to see the same impact on retention of our skilled technicians and leaders in both the commissioned and non-commissioned ranks. So we've got to turn it around.
Thank you. So, Admiral, right around the time you left the Navy was about the last time we did do a force structure assessment, which, as the chairman said, is 308 ships. Could you talk a little bit about, what the world looked like then as you were, again, finishing a distinguished career, and what it looks like today, and why that reassessment is needed?
Well, I retired about 10 years ago. We had just done a very successful set of operations over in the Middle East, going after Al-Qaeda. The Russians really were no longer confrontational. It was not the Russia of the Cold War days. They were rebuilding, trying to internally. China was just coming out of its cocoon. When I was commander of the 7th Fleet, about 5 years before that, I made port visits to China. I was the first admiral to go into Hong Kong after reversion. The Chinese were much more cooperative than they are today. They were not grabbing islands and claiming territorial seas that truly don't exist. We've got a different environment today. We have much graver threats. The idea that there's going to be a confrontation in the Spratlys, or more seriously, in my view, the Senkakus with Japan, is going to directly affect every American. And if we were to go to combat with the forces we have today, we would not be as effective, and I would question our ability to succeed against a China that was serious about going on the offensive against us in that theater. I just can't state enough that we do not have sufficient forces out there to take them on, or for that matter, North Korea, who, as we all know, is developing a nuclear weapon and the means to deliver it. The idea that we're just going to develop a defensive capability against nuclear weapons that are lobbed against our bases in Japan, against our ground forces in South Korea, is insanity. Without a strong military, we may as well just withdraw and admit that we're going to be isolationists, because that's the direction we're headed. I'm very concerned about it. As I mentioned, I have daughters and sons-in-law who are on active duty, who have been in harm's way, and I don't want to lose them without a committed nation behind them.
The distinguished gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Burns, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen. Both of you have good, strong, long-time connections to the state of Alabama. Secretary Layman to my hometown of Mobile, and Admiral, you're a son of the state of Alabama. And we appreciate both of you. Thank you for your service. 2 weeks ago, I was in China at a conference, and one of the days in the conference, we spent talking about the military situation there. We had a representative from the United States side, a representative from the Chinese side. And the Chinese representative was remarkably candid and very worrisome. I'd like to read a portion, just a few sentences of what he had to say, and ask you to react to it. To some extent, I think, Admiral, you've already addressed it, but I'd like you to be a little more specific about what we would do in response to this. But listen to what he said. Now, this is the Chinese speaking. As is well known, security frictions between China and the U.S. for a long time have occurred mainly within the first island chain. Chinese efforts to secure reunification across the Taiwanese Strait and to safeguard its territory, sovereignty, and maritime rights and interests in the East China Sea and the South China Sea face incessant U.S. interference and intervention. And here's the key sentence. The development of a new balance of power will be marked by China's enhanced capacity to safeguard its territory and sovereignty and maritime rights and interests, and a weakened U.S. capability to intervene. That's the Chinese perspective on us. So if we're going to reverse that, specifically, what do we need to do?
Well, those are very strong words. Because they're said does not make them truth. There are legitimate disagreements as to who those atolls and reefs really belong to, if anyone, because they are atolls and reefs, and international law and maritime practice has a definition about those. The idea that the Chinese are claiming an additional 645,000 square miles of ocean resources, fisheries, mineral rights on the seabed, and potentially waters to restrict maritime commerce and the passage of naval ships out of the Straits of Malacca up to Japan, up to our Southeast Asian friends, is absolute insanity. Saying it does not make it true, any more than Putin claiming that Ukraine is part of Russia makes it true. The reality is the longer we allow this to happen, the more difficult is going to become to reverse it or stop it. The fact that they're putting very capable weapon systems on these sandbars and we're watching it happen, in my view, is a mistake. Having said that, I would be the first to say, if in fact we're going to contest it, if we're going to challenge it with our neighbors in Southeast Asia and in East Asia, we need to do it with more capable forces than the United States has deployed there today.
Mr. Secretary?
Yes, I would echo that. I have made 2 official visits, not official as far as I was concerned, but as far as the Chinese were concerned, since I left the government. Both times at the invitation of very senior people in the defense ministry, Liu Qing, who is the head of the Navy, and so forth. I find that statement totally consistent with the stated intentions in both of those visits. They were, my first visit, which was around 1992, they were more in sorrow than in anger. Why are you disarming? Why are you're abandoning, you're creating a vacuum here in the Western Pacific, and you are going to create all sorts of instability because your Navy is not here anymore. We used to, every time we looked out the window in a Hong Kong hotel, we saw a carrier and its escorts there, and this provided a stability that relieved us of the worry that control of the strategic straits, which are obsessive with the Chinese, of the Straits of Sunda and Malacca, they are not going to let that happen, and they told us that. And they said, well, we're going to build aircraft carriers because we don't have base rights in those areas, but we are going to not allow the vacuum that you are creating to persist. And so I find the Chinese, other than some of their more bellicose junior military officers, junior, 1, 2 stars, which seem to have a franchise of making outrageous statements. But I find the official statements of their military very consistent and not necessarily pointed hostilely at the U.S. I don't believe that they intend to invade the U.S. or seize the Hawaiian Islands, but I do believe they view us now. But the Taiwan problem is a separate set of issues which we could spend all day talking about. But the fact is that they really are dependent on virtually all of their oil to be imported, and imported through straits that are potentially not secure. And so they are building, they've told us, they're building a 600-ship Navy. And if you try to interfere, you would do so at your peril. And that at least we can understand what their intentions are, which they do not have the equivalent confidence. They don't know what our strategy is. And I think one reason is because we have no strategy.
My time is up. I really appreciate your comments. Thank you.
Thank you.
Gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Langevin, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Layman and Admiral Natter, thank you both for your service to our country and for your testimony here today. For both of you, I don't agree. I don't disagree with anything you've said in terms of strength, in terms of where we were and where we are. The challenge, of course, that we have and the circumstances that were different back when you were there and where we are now is the significant national debt that the annual budget deficits and a crushing national debt that we have to contend with, which in itself is a threat to U.S. national security, both short-term and long-term. So given those circumstances, what is your guidance and advice to how we now balance those realities with the priorities that we have in being able to defend the country and have the size force that we actually need, given the the budget realities that we're in?
Well, I'm not here to testify as the former Office of Management and Budget. Having said that, I fully agree that is a huge threat to the security of this nation. And there has to be a handle on our budget deficit. I think there is bipartisan concern appropriately for that, and I think there's recognition in a bipartisan way for the problems of the deficit. Having said that, the security of this nation, I think, is first and foremost. I think George Washington would have believed that, and I think he lived that reality. So I think the idea of a 350-ship Navy and a balanced military is a priority, and that I think that it is affordable. I think the nation is going to have to get a handle on how it's paid for and how other cost impacts of the national budget and the deficit have to be gotten under control. But I'm not here to testify about that, sir.
Congressman, I think that, as I had mentioned earlier, Teddy Roosevelt's famous dictum, to speak softly but carry a big stick, is very important today, because we have allowed our defenses, for whatever the sound reasons, and I don't disagree with anything you said on the budgetary issues that we face. Nevertheless, we have, in the hopes that after the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, that we would have a relatively peaceful era ahead that did not require the kinds of sacrifices that we had to do in the Cold War. That has not proved to be the case. Our hopes have proved false. And we now have nuclear hostile powers, even like North Korea, and others emerging. We've got the unique problems of Islamist terrorism, and we've allowed our deterrent to really erode, I mean seriously erode. And by deterrence, that means, are you persuading the potential enemies you have, the potential bad actors, that they would suffer more than they could possibly gain if they took actions against American interests? Our deterrence is failing. It's failing to deter the Chinese from building its bases in the South China Sea, and it's failing in deterring the Russians from reestablishing a hegemony that they feel they have lost in their near abroad. And it's failing to deter a lot of other potential actors down the road. So what do we do about this? Well, I totally agree with the Admiral. We can't afford it. We're only spending 3% of the GDP on defense today. In the Kennedy and Eisenhower years, it was 8 to 9%. In President Reagan's years, it was about 3.5 to 3.75%. So you're not talking of a vast change to reestablish deterrence, but it's going to take some time. And the dangerous thing about doing what we are doing as we did in the 30s, and that is speak loudly and make bold declarations about getting the Chinese out of the South China Sea, as we continue to erode our naval and other services capabilities, is the worst of all possible dangerous situations, because that historically has led to miscalculations. You know, in the 30s, we spoke boldly, and we imposed embargoes, the steel embargo, the scrap embargoes, oil embargoes on Japan, as we disarmed, as we adhered to the Washington naval agreements and built no capital ships until this subcommittee, which was then a full committee, passed the 1936 initiative to start building capital ships. Up to that time, we had adhered to the Washington naval agreements, and the Japanese did not. They withdrew from the Washington treaties, and so they grew and we shrank. And I think that was a major cause of World War II in the Pacific. So we've got to maintain deterrence. We don't have a choice. And people have to start articulating this, because the American people will support it if their leaders on both sides of the aisle. And I might, just as an aside, to perhaps upset some of my revered Republican colleagues. I know the chairman knows his history better than I do, but the fact is there are only 3 presidents in the history of the United States that never built a single capital ship for the U.S. Navy, and those were all Republicans, ending up with Hoover. That's a history we don't want to repeat, for sure. So I think my last point would be, let's be careful. As Reagan proved, you don't have to have achieved a 600-ship Navy to have 90% of the deterrent. You have to make it clear that you're heading there. You are rebuilding. There is strong bipartisan support to maintain deterrence. Once you've achieved that, because it's a game of perceptions, but perceptions based on people who are smart, and they read our mail, and they know what the reality is of our capabilities and our weaknesses. And so, whereas if we had the full deterrent, we might take actions, not necessarily hostile or violent actions right away, but we might begin to put the pressure on the Chinese and force them out of those militarized islands. But today, if we do risk a conflict by miscalculation, and that far away with as small as a force that we have today, it might not end well for us.
I appreciate both your insights, your testimony here today. I know my time's expired, but I take your words to heart, and I thank you for what you've imparted to the committee today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The chairman of the Readiness Committee, Mr. Whitman from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. Thanks for your service. I wanted to talk about two issues I believe we see with Navy force structure. One is amphibious lift. I think we are doing more to address that this year. I want to thank the chairman for all of his efforts and that continuing effort to address what I believe is a shortcoming in amphibious lift. But I do want to get your perspective on where we are with our submarine force. Couple of different tracks. You see China continuing to grow their fleet, moving eastward through the South China Sea into the Pacific, more presence there. Secondly, with the Russians, the fifth-generation submarine, the Yasen class, the Severodvinsk, very, very capable attack submarine. We see those forces going in that direction. We see our forces going in the opposite direction. 30-year shipbuilding plan shows us going down to a 41-boat force in our attack submarines. We see, too, a gap between Ohio-class retirements, Ohio-class replacement availability. We see back and forth about a national sea-based deterrence fund to make sure that we can fund Ohio-class replacement. Give me your perspective on what we need to do overall with our submarine force, which I believe is truly going to be the most tactically and strategically important element of our Navy, not to discount the others, but to have that as part of the nuclear triad, but also the ability to keep up with pretty advanced submarines with the Russians and the numbers of Chinese submarines that we'll see out there. Give me your perspective on what we need to do, both in our attack class and our Ohio class, to make sure that we counter what we see going on with the other, we'll call them near peers.
Well, I strongly support the idea of a strategic funding approach to rebuilding our strategic deterrent, because while this is one of the proudest of Navy roles and missions, nevertheless, it is only very indirectly related to maintaining command of the seas. And if the Navy is forced to fund the entire replacement of the Ohio class, there will, under almost any feasible funding scenario, not be enough money to even maintain the fleet we have. So as an approach, I think that's the right approach. But our submarine force, just to go back to command of the seas, to protect our vital interest and restore deterrence, is the idea that we're going to end up with 41 or even 48 nuclear attack subs is insufficient, because the biggest vulnerability we have today, and in my judgment is severe, is in anti-submarine warfare. We've allowed a lot of our anti-submarine systems, not just the ones on ships and submarines, but overall, to deteriorate significantly. And we've got to rebuild that. And we have, to me, it's unbelievable how a succession of CNOs let this happen. But we have no frigates in the fleet. This is unbelievable. And the idea, I am a strong supporter of the LCS and have been from the beginning. I think both of the versions of it are good ships for certain roles, but they will never be frigates. I don't care how big a plug you put in and how much fuel you stuff in, they will never be frigates. They were never designed to be frigates. Frigates are one of the most essential parts of protecting a naval force at sea. A Marine amphibious group, an Army resupply flotilla, or a carrier battle group. You've got the threats. The submarine threat is so much greater today. Not only the Russian and Chinese, the Russian subs are the equal or better of our best submarines from the Cold War, but you've got over 100 very, very quiet diesel electrics or closed propulsion circuit modern submarines that are really quiet. And that is a huge threat, because we have really, because of higher priorities, we've let that dimension of our protection of surface ships really deteriorate. So, this always gave all of my nuke friends heart attacks when I would suggest it. And I'm not suggesting that we don't build a nuclear attack submarine fleet up above 60 at least. But I believe we need a high-low mix. I think the modern, particularly German technology in closed propulsion conventional submarines, which cost a quarter or less than a nuclear submarine, a high-low mix is probably what we ought to have in the future. And I guess I'm not going to be invited to the Army-Navy game this year, but that's what I think.
My ticket.
Gentleman's time's expired. Ms. Gabbard from Hawaii is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen. Follow up to Mr. Whitman's question. That was kind of what I wanted to talk about as you spoke broadly about the nuclear threat coming from North Korea to places like Japan and South Korea. Representing Hawaii, this is something that as North Korea beats its drums and makes its threats, Hawaii falls within range of their ICBM capabilities and now the miniaturized nuclear capabilities that they're talking about. And so this question of our submarines, the projected reduction and the need for us to be able to maintain that is something that's critical. But really also the entire ballistic missile defense capability that we're looking at is of paramount importance. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that ballistic missile defense and where you see that falls into this need for what you talk about, a bipartisan strategy, a national security strategy.
With respect to ballistic missile defense, as you well know, we have a sea capability as well as a land-based capability. But getting back to our own submarine question, the only way you're going to really protect yourself and defeat that threat is to go on the offensive and knock out their sites before they launch or after they start launching. Because if you remain on the defensive, you will never, ever be able to gain 100% reliability in knocking everything down. Yep. That's the beauty of a submarine. It is a very offensive weapon system. Our purpose in being as a Navy is to destroy the opposition. And if you can't go on the offensive, remain on the offensive, and attack until that threat is destroyed, you're never going to be batting 100% against the threat coming toward you. BMD, land-based and sea-based, is awfully important, very important, and it's pretty well funded. Yeah. But the sea-based threat to that, getting back to the Secretary's commentary on anti-submarine warfare, we need to improve that because the Chinese are developing a significant submarine-based threat, and the Russians are, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, deploying in ways that they have not done since the Cold War. Mm-hmm. That's why the Navy is looking at basing anti-submarine warfare capabilities back in Keflavik, Iceland. It's not because we enjoy cold weather. It's because that's where the Russians operate. Yeah. And we need to work with our allies to go after that threat both offensively and defensively. So ballistic missile defense, I'm in. I'm all in.
Yeah. Thank you.
The ballistic missile defense based on the Aegis has a long history, and well, I will not indulge my tendency in my anecdotage to tell you too much about it. One of the first battles as a new kid working for Henry Kissinger that I was engaged in was the attempt by the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency to block the Aegis cruiser because they alleged, and frankly, they were right, the Aegis missile system, the phased array radar, did violate the ABM agreement in SALT 1. It had the kind of power aperture that clearly was capable of ballistic missile defense. And of course, now it is. It's now part of our ballistic missile defense. That was a long, long time ago, well before you were born. And here we are. Now the Navy got the mission, and now just as the Navy fought a huge battle in 1947 in this room to get a role in the nuclear deterrence, and then after some severe battles, they won that role, and they were in the SIOP, the Single Integrated Operational. But then they suddenly found, hey, wait, being in the SIOP with the nukes meant that they were tied to launch points, and no longer could the fleet move. It had to stay where it is. And the Aegis ballistic missile defense ships are finding the same thing. So while they count in the 300-ship Navy or the 272-ship Navy, they are of limited use in a conventional war, because then you will be in DEFCON 3 or wherever, and you're going to be tied to a specific point. So I'm not arguing for canceling the ABM capability in the Aegis cruiser, but it severely limits the strategic capabilities, the conventional capabilities of deterrence in the fleet. So I believe we need ballistic missile defense. We shouldn't try to delude ourselves. Again, the reality is that our pursuit of Star Wars helped to end the Cold War, because the Russians believed that we could do it, because we showed them we could do so much else. And it was really so far out in terms of cost and capability that it was not an option any of us were really comfortable with, putting all the money that would be necessary to get it going, but it sure paid off, because the Russians, it helped to paint a picture that gave Gorbachev what he needed between the 600-ship Navy kicking him around in the annual exercises and the idea of Star Wars, which his military were telling him, oh yeah, it's going to work, so we've got to have our own, you got to give us 3 times the budget. That's what ended the Cold War. So we do need to stay up on the capability, the technology. We need to deploy it, particularly in land, against Iranian threats and Russian threats now against their near abroad, and North Koreans, who God knows what they'll do. So we should have that capability. But let's not go overboard and tie every Aegis ship to a launch point where they're no longer part of the Navy.
Gentlelady's time has expired. The gentlelady from Missouri, Ms. Hartzler, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you both for your service. My goodness, all the way back to the Revolutionary War. I mean, you don't look that old. But I mean, your family history of serving in the Navy is just admirable. And Admiral, certainly you have so much to be proud of too. I can't imagine your whole family involved in the Navy, and one son still serving in another capacity. But thank you for your service. Wanted to talk a little bit about unmanned capabilities as it relates to the aircraft carriers. And so can you speak to the value of unmanned aviation to an aircraft carrier air wing? I don't think your microphone's on.
Sorry. If I left it on all the time, you'd hear our side comments, which you don't want to do. There is an absolutely important role for unmanned aircraft as part of the carrier air wing. But don't think it's going to solve a lot of manpower or cost problems. It takes more people to operate in a squadron, to maintain and operate a squadron of UAVs today with today's technology than it does manned aircraft. I'm a strong supporter of UCAS. I think it should have a strike capability, but we shouldn't try to make it all things to all possible missions, because you just, that's what we tried to do with the F-35, and look what happened to that. And so what we should do is move in a measured way to me, as a former carrier aviator, the most important thing for me right now, if I were in that planning phase, would be an unmanned tanker as part of the carrier air wing, because our strike aircraft today are less capable in terms of range and payload than they were 30 years ago. So we need to get more range and more payload, and that means you need more tankering. And the reconnaissance, intelligence gathering, and so forth, these are important functions that UCAS can do. Strike versions as well. What we shouldn't do is try to cram all these different missions into one airframe and one system. And it should be done in a measured way. Stealth, I am very much a skeptic on stealth. It has its role in certain places, but the price and the compromises in other capabilities that you have to make to be truly stealthy are not worth it, in my judgment, particularly on a carrier. I don't think that even the F-35 will get more than one truly stealthy flight, because anybody that's ever spent time, as you all have, on an aircraft carrier and sees what goes on down on the deck in pitching seas and salt spray, and particularly towards the end of a deployment, the grease all over the deck, and airplanes starting to slide, and people running with chains and knocking dents into the, it's nobody who has spent time operationally on a carrier believes that stealth can survive on a ship. As it is, the Air Force's stealth aircraft have to go into a clean room after every flight to get their full stealth restored. So it doesn't have to be stealthy. It's nice to have, perhaps for some missions, particularly ISR missions, but we've got to be careful what we're going to give up to get that stealth, particularly in a strike version. It's got a role. There are going to be more of them in the future, but to try to rush into it and put too many requirements on it would be a big mistake.
I represent Whiteman Air Force Base that has the B-2 bomber, stealth bomber, so a little bit familiar with that. I understand what you're saying. Admiral, do you have anything to add in 26 seconds?
Yes, thank you. I certainly agree with the Secretary on this. The real value of having unmanned aircraft is to augment the air wing and the capabilities of our F-18s and F-35s. I see, in addition to an air refueler, which makes a lot of sense to me, the ability to put another ISR node up in the air so that you have not only the F-35 and the E-2 working through NIFCA to the Aegis cruisers and destroyers, you also have an unmanned node up there so that you can spread your ability to attack and defend the battle group and to attack either land targets or other naval targets. As the Secretary of Defense has testified in an open hearing, the Navy's already conducted a significant range attack on a surface target as well as an air target utilizing this. And so unmanned aircraft would fit very well into that approach. But I don't foresee in my lifetime an unmanned air wing operating from a carrier. I just don't see that happening.
Well, I'll believe in it when I get on and fly in the first unmanned United airliner.
Gentlelady's time's expired. Gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Cram, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you so much, gentlemen. I wish I had been here at the beginning. I found this to be so informative. Really appreciate all you bring to this discussion. You mentioned, Mr. Secretary, the Littoral combat ship. I'm interested in talking a little bit more about that. Since I've sat down, you've said that the frigate, you don't want to have the LCS and the different roles it can play. You think the frigate would be a better ship for some purposes. You've also said that a ship can't be all things for all possibilities. If I've quoted you wrong, let me please correct me. How do you see the LCS, its current role, what it's expected to do? Can it meet those challenges? And Admiral, you as well. I think the current budget from the president has decreased the number of LCSs that we're going to be purchasing. Do we need to maintain the number or even increase them? And just how do you see this fitting into our Navy operations today? Thank you.
Well, first of all, I've always been a fan of the LCSs. They do have a role in littoral combat. The modular idea was one of these ideas that, you know, it's a great idea, but actually implementing it is going to cost more than it was worth. But frankly, in their current versions, I think we have enough of them with what the administration has been asking for. But we have built up in 2 shipyards a tremendous capability. This, you know, building I mean, I've owned some shipyards, and building a workforce that really knows what it's doing and knows how to take care of supply chain management and learning curve production, and it takes years. And we've built that kind of capability in Marinette, and we've built it in Mobile. And so whatever we do next, we should do everything possible to keep that organic capability alive by participating in shipbuilding. Right now, building the same littoral combat ship, more of them than has been asked for, I don't see the need for them. Trying to make them either of those 2 hull forms, which each in their way is a tremendous, really, technological achievement, but trying to make them into a frigate. A frigate has to be that multi-role ship. It has to have, first and foremost, anti-submarine warfare capability. It's got to be able to have tow a passive tail, so for passive sonar. It's got to have an active sonar. It's got to be able to defend itself against cruise missiles. It's got to be able to attack other ships and shore. The Perry class, which we've now retired, the last one of them, we called them FIG 7s. They had a little bit of capability in each area, a lot of capability in the anti-submarine area, but they were great ships. We were able to compete them. There were 3 yards building them. The price came down and down and down because we had that annual competition. And they could deploy, they had ranges of over 8,000 miles, so they could deploy with any. People criticized them because they only had a top speed of 28 knots, but they actually could go faster than that. They could keep up with the carriers 98% of the time. And they were great ships, and they were very cost effective. You cannot make take an LCS of either design and get any, you know, they called the F-18, the Super Hornet F-18 was just supposed to be, it was really to get through you guys, it was just an F-18, it was just a Hornet, a little bigger, go longer, faster, et cetera. It was a totally different airplane. It had no commonality. The engines were different, the wing was different, the radar was different. It was a new airplane. And that's what they're going to try to do with the LCS. Call it an LCS frigate, but if it's going to do the frigate job, it will be an entirely new ship, and yet it will have to make compromises to retain some commonality at all with the LCS, and you're going to get the worst of both worlds out of it. I guarantee it. What we need to do, even if we went back to the FIG 7 with modern technology, we have such vulnerability. We now, you know, Admiral Natter used to deploy his battle groups with 28 ships. Today, we average 6 ships, which leaves huge gaps in your layers of defense, particularly against submarines, and particularly against diesel submarines, let alone attack submarines. I mean, nuclear submarines. So I think we need to be realistic about it, and we ought to come up with a frigate design that can be built in these same yards, or at least part of them, if not all of them, and that can be competed on a fixed price base. Don't let the vast bureaucracy, you know, when I owned Hawaii Super Ferry. I'm sorry that Mrs. Gabbard is not here. I mean, she hopefully wrote it at one point. We built that right next, 150 feet from the first aluminum LCS. Roughly the same size ship, both built to ABS, American Bureau of Shipping quality standards. We had, in the lifetime of our ship, we had 2 change orders that we found sand eroded the intakes. There were sort of good common sense changes that did not require any big design changes. 150 feet next to us, the first LCS, the aluminum LCS, which I think was LCS 2, they averaged 75 change orders a week. 75 change orders a week. I had one guy down there as my, what equivalent would be soup ships, to supervise and oversee the shipyards, a great shipyard. The Navy had to build their own building to house all their soup ships people. And as a result, ours came in on budget, because we had a fixed price budget. So we were on budget, on time. 2 change orders. Next door, they came in 3 times the price, the contract price, and a year and a half or 2 years late. And when you try to look at what the change orders did, they were all, you know, move the ashtray from here to there. Some Beltway Bandit had submitted a study that showed if you go from 38 knots top speed to 39 knots top speed, that therefore there were instances where this could make a big difference, and so that change order came down. Nobody knew who approved it, where it came from. It just got into the system from one of the 40 JROC subcommittees. So whatever we do here, and this is really a lot of good ideas are coming out of this committee, we've got to do it along with fixing and carrying out the reforms that you put into the defense bill this year. Because if you just pour that money into the current dysfunctional system, it's wasting the money.
Gentlemen, you've been very patient with us. I have just a few more questions I'd like to ask for the record, though. Admiral, you have spent a fair amount of time with the 7th Fleet in the Asia-Pacific area. Can you just give us a little capsuled version of your experience there? And then if you could also tell us, based upon that experience, as you see our force structure there now, with also what you see with other forces there, how would you assess our capabilities there and your worries, if any?
Yes, sir. As we've discussed prior to that question, the Navy and the fleet, when I was commander of the 7th Fleet, had roughly the same number of ships that are forward deployed there now, today. But we did not have a Chinese Navy that was worthy of being called a Navy. The Russian Navy was back in port trying to keep their ships from rusting to the bottom. I visited Vladivostok. Their ships were a disgrace. The reality, though, is times have changed. We have a Russian Navy that is deploying, as I mentioned before, to Cold War levels. We have North Korea that's developed a nuclear weapon and the means to deliver it, and in the process of means to deliver it. And we certainly have a Chinese Navy that is much more aggressive, much more capable technologically and with force levels, and yet we still have roughly the same size of the 7th Fleet that we had when I was there. The idea, as Secretary Layman has mentioned here today, that we're going to say we're not going to stand for them unilaterally claiming 645,000 square miles of ocean resources, and yet we don't have the means to put up and to confront them in the early stages of what they're doing. Because if we wait and we don't get with our allies and say this is not something that we're going to allow to happen unilaterally, then it's going to become impossible further down the road. And if, as Secretary Layman has mentioned, that we fall into a confrontation with them and we have insufficient forces there to act in a responsible way as a capable Navy, then you're going to have American citizens who are serving our country die. And I would suggest that the government is responsible for that. And I would again applaud this committee for what you're doing to raise that as an important issue, because I had it relatively easy as 7th Fleet Commander. My successor today does not. He has a very, very tough problem to confront.
Would you be concerned if you were the 7th Fleet Commander today?
I think it goes without saying, yes, sir. I would be very concerned about the capability of my forces. Individually, they're great. And let me just say, we've been talking about force levels. The men and women serving in your military today are the best citizens this country could ever ask for. We just need to give them the tools to prevail if we ask them to go do something. And that's what I'm fearful of today.
There's a myth that, or at least I think it's a myth, I'd like to have both of your opinions on it, that we're not going to need to increase the number of ships, in fact, the size of our force structure today, because all of our future battles are going to be done with special forces and with unmanned platforms. Mr. Secretary, how would you respond to that argument? And then, Admiral, if you would give us your thoughts.
Well, of course, the Navy is a very visual service, and that's the advantage. When through the Cold War, our fleet was visible throughout places like Singapore and later Vietnam and Malaysia and Hong Kong and Korea. Everybody knew we were there, and everybody knew these ships had real capability, and nobody doubted the ability of America to command the seas, that is, to protect our allies and to keep free trade traveling and keep freedom of the seas. Today, I meet very few people in my travels who believe that's the case, even though they're totally pro-American. The fact that through most of the last 10 years, we've had no combatants in the Mediterranean, for instance, when we normally had 40 or 50 combatants in the 6th Fleet during the Cold War. Now, they never, I mean, I traveled to places around the Mediterranean, and they say, gee, we haven't had a Liberty call here for 20 years. We haven't had a Navy ship. Don't you have a Navy anymore? Because they don't see it, because we aren't there. And who knows what the next war is going to be tripped by, but there will be conflicts. There have been conflicts. Nobody foresaw before 9/11. All of presidents of both parties were saying that terrorism, yeah, it's a problem, but it's one that, every president that I can recall, including, I must say, my sainted boss, President Reagan, their first response to every terrorist act was, we will bring these people to justice. Well, who gives a damn about bringing these people to justice? You got to prevent it from happening. And today, more and more of our enemies do not see us bringing anybody to justice, and still less being able to deter and to stop and to enforce freedom of the seas and so forth. Cyber is very important, and we were becoming more and more vulnerable to it. I don't know how many dozens of millions of lines of code are in the F-35, for instance. Many of our systems, just as our electrical grid, we think we've protected, but the thousands of hackers that are all over the world, that's just red meat to them. Oh, you think you've got a hack-proof system, and we find out that it's not hack-proof. So who knows where it's going to come from, but history has told us that we cannot predict where and how the next war is going to break out. So you better be prepared for other contingencies than just the favorite ones you would hope would be the problem.
Admiral, how about you?
I'm glad you've asked this question, Mr. Chairman. I served with Naval Special Warfare in Vietnam, worked with 2 SEAL platoons. I have very good friends in Ranger battalions and also Ranger Regiment, and also in Naval Special Warfare, friends and relatives today. They are the very first ones who will tell you that they cannot be effective without the support and interaction of conventional forces. Let me give you an example. The SS Alabama. Those SEALs who shot and killed the pirates who took the captain of the Alabama, how did they get on station? Air Force aircraft. From what platforms were they enabled to take those pirates down? A United States Navy ship, supported by other ships and aircraft. Those SEALs did not just come out of the water and emerge and start shooting. Without conventional forces, without air support for our Rangers and SEALs and other special operators in Iraq and around the world, there's no way they can be as effective as they are today. There is a good place. They are very valuable to this nation. I respect the heck out of them, but I agree with them. They would not be nearly as effective without strong conventional forces around the world.
Yeah, even the delivery of the special forces, for instance, in Desert Storm, came from the Kitty Hawk. I mean, the carriers are not just air wing carriers. I mean, when there was all the uproar during the Clinton administration in Haiti, it was a carrier that took the 2 airborne divisions down to Haiti and delivered them with their helicopters. The Navy is able to project power and to provide support anywhere in the world. Anywhere in the world. We've lost bases, 95% of the bases we had during the Cold War in Europe and in Asia. We don't have land bases. When there's a crisis that can be solved and put down before it escalates into a conflagration, it's the Navy that can go there. Yes, Air Force is an essential part of that as well, but 95% of the tonnage for any military contingency has to travel by sea. And if that's the case, whether it's a prepositioned ship in Diego Garcia or a fast deployment ship or whatever, it's got to be protected by total air superiority and submarine superiority underneath. So there is the idea. It's so typical of Washington armchair think tanks that see this great new wave. That's why a mess was created in our Ford-class carrier, because the think tanks were saying, "Oh, the Navy's so stodgy. They never know what's happening in technology. We have to have a revolution in military warfare. We're going to put 12 new technologies into the aircraft carrier." So there you have a hull. It's the Nimitz hull, and it's got 7 technologies today that we still don't know how to make work.
Last 2 questions, because I know Mr. Courtney needs to go as well. Our carriers, there have been some arguments that we don't need carriers today. We need to maybe reduce the number we have, and there's even a proposal to take one of our carrier air wings out in the budget this year. Can you just tell us how important you think it is that we maintain at least 11 carriers and 10 air wings, or do you think we can reduce them down?
I'd love to take that one on, sir. That assumes, the assumption that we can do away with an air wing assumes that we're going to just be operating in peacetime. What happens when those aircraft go down through hostile fire? We will suffer casualties in warfare. There will be an opposition who wants to kill us as badly as we want to kill them, and they will be successful to a point. So the idea that we're operating on zero margin is crazy. With respect to the number of carriers, we've been operating 10 for really, and will be for about 10 years until Ford comes online and is able to deploy. These ships are, as the Secretary has said, are deploying for 9 months now. It's crazy. And we've adjusted the rotation, the fleet response plan to accommodate really longer deployments. What does that do? It builds up deferred maintenance on the part of these ships and aircraft. The F-18s, they can't get them through depot quickly enough because when they've opened them up, they've found problems that were more critical than they expected, primarily because of the high flight hours on the F-18s. So we need to be able to have sufficient force structure for what the National Command Authority is asking our ships, our squadrons, and our people to do.
Good. Last question for you is this. I think both of you have basically concurred we need about 350 ships. Is that fair? That we have both witnesses are nodding.
Yes.
There was a question that we were asked about what the makeup of those ships would be. We can't get there overnight, but as we start allocating our dollars, where would you suggest we start as we go from where we are today to perhaps one day getting back to 350? What's the most important investments we need to make over the next 5+ years?
Well, I would say the biggest lack is anti-submarine capability, and the frigate is perhaps the most glaring deficiency. The less sexy things, you know, it's everybody likes to debate how many of this and how many of that airplane and ships, but the things like the towed arrays and the former SOSUS arrays and the less sexy things that are fundamentally important to having an environment where you do command the seas, those are the ones that get left out when you get into shooting wars in the Middle East and elsewhere, and you have insufficient budgets, but you're told that you got to keep this many ships and hit these many deployments. All of that unsexy stuff disappears from the budgets. The committees don't concentrate on them because they, you know, if there's only so many things that a committee like yours can really take on. And we are leaving ourselves today in a very dangerous position vis-a-vis the submarines, not just the Chinese, Russian nuclear submarines, but the huge proliferation of good, quiet, diesel-electric subs. And the cruise missile threat, and so much is said by people that say, oh, get rid of the aircraft carriers, they're just targets. We've dealt with the problem of ballistic missile attacks on the submarines for as long as I've been involved with the Navy. The Russians had them. The technology has moved on, but our defensive technology has moved on. So, yes, we're going to get hit. Any of the surface ships are going to get hit by missiles, by conventional missiles. But that doesn't mean that's going to take them out of action or prevent the defeat of our potential enemies. So if there's one issue I would urge you to really focus on, it's our vulnerability to enemy submarines of both conventional and nuclear.
Admiral?
To me, the question really begs a common sense response, an answer. And that is, what is the best way to achieve roughly a 350-ship Navy, because I think in gross numbers that's what the requirement is, and do it in a way where we're not wasting money. Industry's got to be involved in this. We don't want to say, all right, start building 5 submarines a year, for example. You know, that's not going to happen without wasting a lot of money. You've got to, what I would suggest is that we establish as an overall goal, 350. You say, we're going to up it to 3 submarines a year, 3 DDGs a year. We're going to shorten the timeline between the start of a new carrier from 5 years to 4 years. That'll eventually drive it up to 12 carriers. And ASW ships and aircraft. The P-8 is a good start. We need surface ships that can conduct competent ASW. And we also need to build amphibious lift. The Marines have a steady drumbeat, as you all members of Congress know. They need the lift for their people. the way to do that is in a gradual, industry sensitive way that gets us to where we want to go, gets us on the right track, and doesn't burn money in the process.
Yeah, I would just like to add one, Philip, to the Admiral. I agree with him completely. But in the 80s, we froze designs, which enabled contractors to bid fixed price. You can't bid fixed price if there are 75 change orders a week. It's impossible. You got to go to cost plus. That's why everything today in procurement is cost plus, even when they say it's fixed price. It's really every time a change order it comes in, that allows them to escape the strictures of the fixed price contract. So unless the Navy does its part in preventing change orders, then you can't expect contractors to be held to fixed price competitive contracts. The 3-and-3 worked brilliantly during the 80s. We had 3 subs. The low-priced bidder for 2 got the 2, and the high price got the 1. And the same with, that's how we built all the Arleigh Burke destroyers, how we built all the Tycho-class Aegis cruisers, all the submarines. We competed everything every year. And that discipline got better ideas, it got innovations, because when you're looking at the guy running next to you trying to take your extra ship, then things happen. That's how we were able to return $8 billion to the Treasury, in effect. So we got to get back to that. But you can't ask the contractors to take those kinds of risks until you get control of the constant change and the bureaucratic method of running a business, which average, as you know, in the ACAT 1 and 2, we average 22 and a half years to go from the requirement to the first fielding. That's insane. It took 4 years for Polaris and Minuteman, 4 years to do the same thing. But then, of course, the defense bureaucracy was about 1/10 the size it is now.
Gentlemen, we thank you. Mr. Courtney, did you have anything else? Thank you both again for your service to our country. Thank you for laying this foundation for us, which we hope will help us build upon to rebuild the number of ships that we need in our Navy. If either of you have any last comments that you'd like to offer before we go?
Keep up the good work.
Okay.
Amen to that, sir. I would just like to emphasize again, our men and women deserve your support, and I want to thank you and the fellow members of your committee for that support. Good luck with the rest of the Hill.
Well, thank you. With that, we're adjourned. Thank you, Joe. Phil, thank you.
That was a real pleasure to. Same here, sir. Make a good mutton, Jeff.